Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a recent book by Benjamin R. Young of Virginia Commonwealth University entitled Guns, Guerillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World, published by Stanford University Press. Joining us this afternoon are two discussants, Hazel Smith of the University of London and Jean H. Lee of the BBC World Service and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually if not always on Mondays, in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, since pandemic restrictions here in the virtual realm. Today's session is being co-sponsored by the Seeger Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University. Behind the scenes, there are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And we'd like to thank our institutional supporter, the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous donors. And as we say every week, please feel free to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and will soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer period of this webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function that allows you to actually pose your question directly in your own voice, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address will be posted in the chat function. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I now turn over the screen to my colleague, Greg Brzezinski, the interim director of the Seeger Center, before Christian Osterman takes over to moderate today's session. Greg, the Zoom screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. And let me join you in thanking Rachel, Christian, the Wilson Center, the AHA and other organizations who've helped with today's event. The Seeger Center is absolutely delighted to be co-sponsoring today's event. The Seeger Center's goal is to increase the quality and broaden the scope of research and publications on Asia, and also to educate the next generation of scholars, policymakers, and other people who are doing work relevant to Asia. The Seeger Center works closely together with the Asian Studies MA program at the Elliott School of International Affairs. I hope that some of you who are watching and are considering doing a policy-relevant degree about Korea will take a good look. We have more at GW, we have more tenured faculty working on Korea than any other institution in the Washington area. We are the only institution in the Washington area with its own Institute for Korean Studies, and we're the only institution in the Washington area to be recognized as a Title VI National Resource Center by the Department of Education. We have a long history of excellent and successful collaboration with the Wilson Center, the Hyundai Motor Korea Institute as well. We've recently had one student who did an internship with the Korea Institute at the Korea Center, I should say, at the Wilson Center, and had an excellent experience with it. We hope for more collaboration in the months and years to come. And finally, I'm especially pleased to host today's speaker, Benjamin Young, because he himself is an excellent product of our Korea programs at GW. And just delighted to see him publish a book and mature into a very promising young scholar. So thank you, and let me turn the floor back over to Christian.
Thank you, Greg, and good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming to you from Madrid, Spain this evening at an even later hour than it is for one of our commentators, Professor Hazel Smith. Having just had the opening dinner of our week-long workshop, I feel well conditioned for this discussion of North Korea. On a more serious note, it gives me real pleasure to introduce our speakers, and I'll first introduce our keynote speaker, our author, Professor Benjamin Young, and after he speaks, I will introduce our commentators. Benjamin R. Young is an assistant professor of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is the author of Guns, Guerillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World, published by Stanford University Press just a few weeks ago. He received, as mentioned by Greg, his Ph.D. from the George Washington University in 2018. He has previously taught at the U.S. Naval War College and Dakota State University. He has published in peer-reviewed articles on North Korean history and politics in a number of scholarly journals and is a regular contributor to nknews.org. Ben, it's great to have you with us at the Washington History Seminar. Welcome to the seminar, and the Zoom room is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Christian, and thank you very much, Eric, Greg, Hazel, and Jean for being here today. It really is an honor to be able to speak to the audience and get this platform to talk about my book. I was finishing this book during the beginning stages of what I like to call the COVID apocalypse, when we didn't know what was going on. Playgrounds were being off limits. People didn't know whether to buy a mask or not. And I decided this is a great time to finish a book. I'm really proud of this book, and I'm really excited to talk to you all today about North Korea and the Third World. I just want to talk briefly about my book, some of the overall themes, and then we can delve more deeply into the inner workings of the book. In my book, I start off with a brief little anecdote about the African Renaissance Monument, which is in the capital city of Senegal. And this is a massive North Korean-made monument in the capital city. It doesn't look anything African aesthetics. It comes from the socialist realist style. But I like to talk about the North Korean monument there as kind of a way to talk about North Korea's real imprint on the global South, formerly known as the Third World during the Cold War era. As we all know, North Korea is commonly labeled as this hermetic, isolated state. But my book looks at North Korea from a different angle. It looks at North Korea as a dynamic internationalist player that interacted with a wide range of governments, national liberation movements, and rebel groups. And my book also looks at North Korea as a country that adjusts according to global trends and currents. It is not a country in my book that is seen as anachronistic or as the Stalinist relic. And there's really four main themes in my book that I cover. The first is this idea of North Korea as a developmental model. To us today, that seems kind of ridiculous, right? When we see North Korea, we think of people in fields using ox plows because they don't have mechanized agriculture. We think of this nuclear development program. You think of the news headlines talking about Kim Jong-un loving cheese. You wouldn't think of North Korea as a developmental model, but many post-colonial governments looked at North Korea as a successful model of post-colonial and post-war development. Robert Mugabe, the former leader of Zimbabwe, was actually someone who really admired the North Korean model of development. In the 1980s, he went to Pyongyang, and he came back to Harare talking about the wonders of the North Korean governance structure. One of his officials said that Mugabe came back almost a different man. And Mugabe was not exceptional in coming back from a trip to North Korea and talking about the wonders of North Korean socialism. There are many post-colonial leaders who went to Pyongyang and talked about how they admired the North Korean unique brand of socialist development. The second theme of my book is Pyongyang's support of national liberation movements and governments. Today, North Korea is seen as an aid recipient, but actually during the Cold War era, North Korea was an aid donor, and it donated resources, trainers, and military specialists to post-colonial governments all over the world. And they also helped to train national liberation movements in Southern Africa, such as the ANC and SWAPO. And there's also a unique little anecdote in my book where I talk about how North Korea helped to train a Mexican rebel group known as the Movement for Revolutionary Action. And so North Korea today is seen as this isolated, hermetic state, but it really wasn't. It really wanted to be this hotbed and bastion of third world rebellion and insurrection. The third theme of my book is inter-Korean competition. And that was always in the backdrop of North Korea's foreign policy during the Cold War era, was competing with South Korea for diplomatic recognition. And up until about the mid-1970s, the North Korean model looked more successful than the South Korean model. It was really in the 1980s and late 1970s when South Korea's economic growth, it became quite obvious that that was the more successful model of development. The fourth theme of my book looks at Kim Il-sung's personal relationships with third world leaders. He had relationships with a number of socialist-oriented leaders, but he also formed relationships with leaders that came from different political leanings. For example, Prince Sihanouk, the Cambodian royalty, had a very close personal friendship with Kim Il-sung. The North Korean government actually made him a villa on the outskirts of Pyongyang. Prince Sihanouk actually hired North Korean bodyguards to protect him because he trusted them more than Cambodian bodyguards. So those are the kind of the four overall themes of my book. And I want to also briefly talk about what I think is one of the most unique aspects of North Korean foreign policy during the Cold War era, and that was its close relations with Cuba and with Vietnam. Typically today, when we talk about North Korea's foreign relations, we emphasize China or South Korea or Japan or the United States. But Cuba and North Korea were really ideological allies. North Korea also sent Cuba aid after Hurricane Flora in the early 1960s. In addition, the famous revolutionary martyr Che Guevara traveled to North Korea and deeply admired the country's rapid post-war reconstruction. He went on a tour of the entire Eastern Bloc, and when he came back to Havana, a journalist asked him, which country did you most enjoy? Which country did you most admire? And he said the DPRK. And North Korea also supported Castro's militancy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. As far as Vietnam, North Korea was a very close ally of the Vietnamese communists during the Vietnam War. For example, North Korea sent pilots and military specialists to help the communists. In addition, North Korea projected itself as a model of post-war rehabilitation to the Vietnamese leadership. North Korea saw Vietnam as a war to reduce U.S. military presence in all of Asia. They saw the Vietnam War as their own war. And they even had articles in their state-run media asking for volunteers to go fight against the U.S. imperialist lackeys in Vietnam. Ultimately, there are no North Korean, quote, volunteers in Vietnam, but it was kind of a unique situation with North Korea was this internationalist hotbed where they wanted to help their Vietnamese comrades. And another angle, there's two other angles I want to talk about before I let my discussants ask questions and we get into a Q&A. And that this theme that I want to talk about is the unique way in which North Korea found exportable niches in the third world. The Soviet Union, the United States were powerhouses. They had more money, they had more funds, they had more specialists and trainers and advisors. But what North Korea had was unique developmental niches, such as building palaces, training elite military units. For example, North Korea helped to train Mugabe's elite military guard known as the 5th Brigade. The North Korean trained 5th Brigade in Zimbabwe then went on to kill dissidents in Matabeleland. And this is still widely known today in Zimbabwe, and North Korea has a very bad reputation in Matabeleland. In addition, North Korea exported the mass games throughout Africa. The mass games are the famous North Korean mass gymnastics events. And so North Korea exported the mass games all over Africa, sending mass games specialists and advisors to help train African youth about the proper way to pledge loyalty to their regimes. And the final theme that I want to talk about is Juche ideology. In my book, I talk about Juche, and there's a lot of literature out there about what Juche means. In my book, I look at Juche as an ideal, a utopian vision of the future in which North Korea hopes to achieve complete self-reliance and total self-sufficiency. And in many ways, North Korea's Juche discourse aligned with post-colonial development rhetoric. It was not something uniquely Korean. North Korea's Juche was actually something that was really part of this anti-colonial rhetoric that was circulating around the third world. For example, Tanzania leaders talked about how Juche resonated with their own indigenous concept of Ujamaa. And so when we think about Juche, I think it's important to also take into consider some of the post-colonial third worldist developmental discourses that was going around in 1960s and 70s and how North Korea was part of this rhetoric. And I want to end on what I think is the best quote that I found in my book, and it's in my conclusion. And I think it's a great summarization of how a lot of third world actors felt about North Korea during the Cold War era. It's the first paragraph in my conclusion. It reads, in the early 1980s, historian John Holliday asked Gennaro Canero Checa, a radical Peruvian writer and frequent traveler to the DPRK, who published a book on the country in 1997 entitled Korea, Rice and Steel, his honest opinion of North Korea. Checa replied, they fought the North Americans. They have done incredible things in the economy. It's the only third world country where everyone has good health, good education, and good housing. Holliday then asked Checa his view of North Korea as a poet. Checa said, it is the saddest, most miserable country I've ever been in my life. As a poet, it strikes bleakness into my heart. And I think that's a really good quote that sums up how a lot of people in the global South looked at North Korea. It was a nuanced take. It wasn't all good. It wasn't all bad. This was a country that achieved very rapid development, but it came at a cost, and that cost was human rights and personal freedoms. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. We'll now turn to our commentators, and we really have two very distinguished Korea hands on our panel this evening. We'll start with Jean Lee. Jean Lee is a journalist and analyst who currently serves as co-host of the Lazarus Heist podcast for the BBC World Service and is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., my home institution, where she stood up the Korea Center. Previously, Jean Lee led the Associated Press news agency's coverage on the Korean Peninsula as bureau chief from 2008 to 2013. In 2011, she became the first American reporter granted extensive access on the ground in North Korea. And in January 2012, she opened AP's Pyongyang bureau. Since 2008, Jean has made dozens of extended reporting trips to North Korea, visiting farms, factories, schools, military academies, and homes in the course of her exclusive coverage across the country. As a foreign correspondent, she has reported from Asia, across Asia, Africa, South America, United Kingdom, and Europe, as well as reporting from across the United States. Jean is a native of Minneapolis. She has a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies and English Literature from Columbia and a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She appears in Netflix's How to Become a Tyrant, National Geographic's Inside North Korea, and PBS's The Dictator's Playbook. Jean, a warm welcome. Glad to have you here, and the floor is yours. The Zoom room is yours. Jean.
Thank you. That bio is way too long. But first of all, I want to congratulate Dr. Young on this publication. It is packed with clearly years of research. And I have to say that photo of you pinned to your Twitter feed of you holding the book in your hands, the joy is so palpable. So everyone go check out his Twitter feed. It's at Dubstep in DPRK, if I have that right, Ben. But I'd also like to thank Christian and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, as well as Eric and everyone at the National History Center and GW and Greg for inviting me to join this panel today and for including a book on North Korea in this season's lineup. I think we've been pretty good over the past couple of years with making sure we have a Korea book in the lineup. So I'm very grateful that we have North Korea in this year's season. And, you know, as Dr. Young mentioned, this is such a refreshing pivot from the discussions we're having right now on North Korea, which tend to focus, of course, on the provocations. We're in the middle of a spate of testing right now and really preoccupied by this immediate question of how to deal with North Korea's destabilizing nuclear ambitions. And, you know, I always think it's important to take a step back and look at history to help us understand the present. We talk about this a lot at the Wilson Center, especially with a country like North Korea, where the leadership leans on history to justify its actions, and where the leadership seeks to control the narrative by cutting off access. And so if we don't take a comprehensive look at North Korea, past and present, I think we risk buying completely into the propaganda that the regime is turning out right now. And this is, of course, at a time when we have so little access. The borders have been sealed for nearly 2 years now, and the flow of information has been reduced to this trickle of state media. So I think I'll start by making a few comments about the book and about the topic, and then I have some questions for you, Dr. Young. And as you noted earlier, I'll start by saying that so much of our focus here in Washington does tend to be on North Korea's relationships, as you mentioned, with the United States, with its neighbors in Northeast Asia, China, of course, South Korea and Japan. But I think you're right to look at North Korea's relationships around the world because we focus so much on North Korea's very contentious and complicated relationship with the United States. People are often surprised to hear that North Korea has diplomatic relations with 160 countries, and maybe you can correct me if because that number has gone up and down in the last couple of years. And I explain that, we discussed this in my podcast about North Korean cyber, the Lazarus heist, but I do think that understanding how that overseas network serves the regime's objectives is important to understanding how the leadership's domestic and foreign policy priorities play out, how they've been constructed. And this is their economic, political, social, and cultural policies. And I was just going to share a story because I'm not an academic, but as a journalist, I did spend time in Africa. And I did come across as a journalist some very intriguing hints about those relationships. Eye-opening because, of course, I hadn't thought at all about North Korea's relationships with Africa. But, in 2010, I was sent to cover the North Korean men's soccer team at the World Cup finals in South Africa. It was the first time in 44 years that the North Korean men had qualified for the finals. And I have to admit, I don't know much about soccer or football as it's called in the rest of the world, but I was sent to write about the political implications of having North Korea at the World Cup. And of course, and Ben, you may remember this, but one of the first things I spotted at the first match against Brazil was this group of North Korean fans in the stands. Now, these are not those well-trained mass games trainers or cheerleading squads, the young women that we've seen North Korea send to different events. Ri Sol-ju, the wife of Kim Jong-un, was one of these cheerleaders in her past life. But these men were much older. They were very tanned. They had wizened faces, just clearly men who had spent long days under the sun doing hard labor. And when I asked them where they had come from, they insisted they had flown in from Pyongyang for the World Cup. And, at the time, it was clear to me that that wasn't the case. These were men who were wearing those really thin-soled blue, I think they're called pinsoles, and Hazel can correct me, but I think that, very thin-soled sneakers that we see that North Korean workers wear, their everyday shoes that everyday North Koreans wear. And they had a red cap on with the initials MOP. For Mansade Overseas Project. And so, in fact, they had been bussed in from a construction site, I believe in Namibia. So it certainly woke me up to the fact that North Korea had large populations of construction workers in Africa. You do cover some of this in your book, Ben, so please check out that section. But I think even more fascinating for me than even those relationships, the construction projects, was the hidden histories of those relationships and how Africa fit into Kim Il-sung's broader foreign policy strategies. Fascinating. I think you're absolutely right to look at this strategy and what you called third worldism as forming, and I'm going to quote you here, a fundamental part of North Korea's national identity during the Cold War era. And now I want to quote Francis Fukuyama, who you cite. And he says, national identity begins with a shared belief in the legitimacy of the country's political system, whether that system is democratic or not. But national identity also extends into the realm of culture and values. It consists of the stories that people tell themselves, where they came from, what they celebrate, their shared historical memories, what it takes to be a genuine member of the community. I want to thank you because I found this quote very helpful. I think it very aptly describes how the Kims have ruled North Korea. They have pinned the preservation of North Korea's political system and their way of life on a constructed national identity. And it's clear that it's one that revolves around the Kim family. And it's clear that from the episodes that you recount that Kim Il-sung leaned on his charm and his charisma to cultivate these relationships. And so I would say this book is as much a portrait of Kim Il-sung as anything, and the exploration of his personality and his personal relationships, I think does give us valuable context for that Kim family rule and the construction of that identity. And I want to mention the case of Cuba as well, which I found the case of the Cuban ambassador to North Korea absolutely intriguing. You found these cables showing how the North Korean people rioted against him in Pyongyang in 1965. And I think you're right in raising the question about how Kim's strategy of portraying the outside world as inherently evil, again, that's your phrase, plays out on the ground in reality. And yet Kim Il-sung gave that very same ambassador a fond farewell. And glossed over the tension for the sake of their national relationship and for his personal relationship with this particular Cuban, and to maintain that illusion of friendship. And I thought that was such a telling indication of not only his strategy, but of his charisma and the importance of personal relationships. And I'll get back to that in the questions. I was also interested in your portrayal of Kim Jong-il's use of the third world as a space to undermine South Korea and the United States. And you note that in the wake of some of that violence that he engineered, in particular that 1983 assassination attempt in Burma, as well as the attack in Burma, as well as the use of weapons and military capabilities and other nefarious activities, as you call it, that some of North Korea's third world partners woke up to some of those less than savory elements and motives and cut diplomatic ties with Pyongyang. And this is interesting in the context of what we've seen in the last few years with some countries with diplomatic ties to North Korea making similar decisions, particularly in 2016 and 2017 during the current leader Kim Jong-un's rule in the face of those nuclear provocations. Okay, so I did want to ask you a few questions. I did have one basic question, which is what prompted you? I'm always curious to know what prompted you to look at North Korea's relationships with the global South, with the third world. I know there's probably a personal narrative or story that took you down this path. I'm grateful that it did take you down this path. I'm curious to hear more about that. And I want to ask you about access and sources, because you make great use of archival materials, and we love that, of course, at the Wilson Center. But I would like to hear more about the challenges to access that you faced, how you got around them. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic, which perhaps was another element of the challenge, but it sounds to me like you did the bulk of your research before everything shut down. What more would you have liked to have had access to, and what did you find surprising? And I have one more question, which is, about a question about leadership today. You do go into quite a bit of detail and analysis about Kim Il-sung, his foreign policy strategy. And I'm curious how that might help inform Kim Jong-un's foreign policy today. We do see Kim Jong-un emulating his grandfather. What is he taking from this era of building relationships with, close personal relationships with leaders in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere? Is Kim Jong-un following in that footsteps? Is he still cultivating those relationships, or has he abandoned the third world in order to focus on the United States and China? And how have nuclear weapons figured into that calculus, if you think that's the case? And what are we missing by not paying attention to North Korea's relationships with the global South or the third world today? And I'm particularly interested because I may be coming back to you as I continue to do research for my podcast and start to look at some of those relationships and what we need to know about how that impacts cyber as well as other forms of illicit money-making for North Korea. Thank you so much. And again, congratulations.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Gene. I really appreciate it.
Go ahead, Ben. Thanks,
Okay.
Gene, for some excellent comments.
So the first question is, how did I get interested in this kind of very niche, somewhat narrow topic? Because it's definitely not the typical North Korea book. I have a lot of family members and friends, and this is the first book they're reading about North Korea, and I'm like, you're in for a bit of a doozy here. There's really two reasons. First is I traveled to North Korea in 2012. I had just graduated from college, and I had not traveled overseas. And I said, "Hi, how about traveling to North Korea and rural China?" So I actually spent 2 months in the Yanbian region of China, learning the North Korean dialect. And during that trip, it was part of a group called it was part of a Canadian NGO group called the Pyongyang Project. Michael Spavor is actually part of that group. And he and a bunch of other Westerners, including myself, we went to North Korea twice. And during that trip, we went to the Juche Tower in the middle of Pyongyang. And at the tower, as you probably know, Gene, there's plaques dedicated to North Korea from Juche study groups and friendship groups. And I noticed that a lot of these plaques at the base of the Juche Tower came from those in what is considered the global South. So you have like the Juche study group of Nigeria, the Juche study group of Malawi. And I thought that was quite interesting. Why were so many African organizations intrigued with North Korea? So then I went back to the United States. I started reading a bit more, looking into this unique history. And this brings me to my second reason why I was interested in this topic. And that is my master's thesis looked at the Black Panther Party's relations with North Korea. The Black Panther Party were a prominent Black radical organization in the United States, primarily centered out of the Bay Area in California in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And they had a fairly coherent and strong relationship with the North Korean government. It really started from Eldridge Cleaver, the very controversial leader of the Black Panther Party during the late 1960s. He went to North Korea twice during this period of time. He formed a very strong personal friendship with the North Korean leadership. And when I was looking through the Black Panther Party newspaper during the course of my master's thesis research, I saw that there was this third worldist rhetoric, and that it wasn't only being published by the Black Panther newspaper. When I was looking at the North Korean state-run media during this period of time, they had similar rhetoric. And I thought, okay, there is this different international order that is not the liberal international order, which the US likes to boast about. It's not the Soviet-style socialist orbit. It's something different. And the Black Panthers and the North Koreans, the Cubans, and the Vietnamese were all part of this very unique anti-colonial order. And that is really the reason why I thought that I needed to delve more into North Korea's broader history of relations with third world actors. As for your second question about sources, as we all know, we can't just go into Pyongyang and look at the archives of the Korean Workers' Party. That is impossible to the outsider and most likely impossible to the average North Korean citizen. Who knows if ever we will have access to the Korean Workers' Party's inner archives. But the best way to look at North Korea as a historian today is by looking at North Korea's former communist allies. And the Woodrow Wilson Center has a fabulous online archival database through the Cold War International History Project and the North Korea International Documentation Project, which Christian has helped to spearhead. And these sources are vital for Cold War historians. And I was able to take advantage of looking at North Korea from Soviet, East German, Romanian, Hungarian archival sources that were then translated into English. And not only do I use these former Eastern Bloc countries' archives, but I also looked at North Korean state-run media. I also looked at newspapers from the Third World, so African, Sub-Saharan African newspapers. I looked at many different journalistic accounts and, of course, secondary sources as well. But when you are a historian working on North Korea, you unfortunately can't just go into Pyongyang and look at the archives there. And another actual great resource for historians of East Asia in general is the UK National Archives. The UK National Archives are great. They have a very efficient, up-to-date, modern system, which you sometimes don't find at the National Archives in the United States. And it's the UK National Archives. I found just a plethora of documents related to North Korea's activities in the Third World. And a lot of that is because the British, as former colonialists, they kept a close eye on their former colonies, and they didn't want their former colonies turning into Eastern Bloc puppet states. And so you had a lot of kind of unique British diplomatic accounts of what the North Koreans were doing. For example, in Uganda, the Ugandan government was actually employing British mercenaries, but then they decided to actually get North Korean military advisors involved because it was cheaper, and the North Koreans were frankly more brutal than the British mercenaries in helping to train them. And so you have a lot of unique kind of perspectives coming from the British archives. And as far as your third question, in terms of what we can take from how Kim Il-sung approached the third world states to what Kim Jong-un is doing now, obviously times are very different, and Kim Jong-un is a different leader. But in many ways, he's trying to replicate his style, his political style, on his grandfather. For example, you have him evoking the Chollima age as this golden period of North Korean socialism. You also have Kim Jong-un trying to emphasize socialism and even communist traits in terms of political education within the DPRK. I think in terms of the Kim family dynasty, who is really the outlier, it's Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il was very different because he was much more violent and militant in how he interacted with third world countries. For example, in 1983, he helped to orchestrate the bombing in Burma that was aimed at the former president of South Korea, Chun Doo-hwan. And in terms of how Kim Jong-un might approach the third world in the future, I think we're going to see a lot more cyber heists. So such as what happened with the Bangladesh Central Bank in 2016, in which North Korean hackers stole close to $81 million from the central bank of Bangladesh. I think the North Korean hackers now look at the third world as a place where they can exploit some security issues, whether that is in the cyberspace or whether that is in an international airport like in Malaysia, where a North Korean inspired agent helped to take out Kim Jong-un's half brother. So I think that this period of solidarity in which North Korea had this kind of anti-colonial brotherhood with third world countries is a thing of the past. And I think now North Korea is a very different country that is just trying to survive and trying to promote some sort of economic development along the same line as military development. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks for your kind words about the Wilson Center's North Korea International Documentation Project. All of our holdings are accessible to anyone who's interested at digitalarchive.org. With that plug, I'll turn now to our second distinguished commentator, really one of the world's leading Koreanists, Professor Hazel Smith. Professor Smith is a professorial research associate in Korean Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and she is Professor Emerita International Security at Cranfield University. As well, she's also a member of the Global Futures Council on Korea of the World Economic Forum. She's received her Ph.D. in International Relations from the London School of Economics. Her many publications include The Ethics of United Nations Sanctions on North Korea, Effectiveness, Necessity, and Proportionality, published in Critical Asian Studies in 2020. North Korea, Markets and Military Rule, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. And Hungry for Peace, International Security, Humanitarian Assistance, and Social Change in North Korea, published by the US Institute of Peace in 2005. Professor Smith has researched East Asian security and North Korea for over 30 years and has been regularly called on to advise government agencies worldwide. He's a frequent broadcaster in global media on North Korea and East Asian security. She, like Jean Lee, has lived in North Korea for 2 years while working for UN, WFP, and UNICEF, earning there, as she would want us to point out, a still valid North Korean driver's license. Hazel Smith is also a former Wilson Center Fellow, and we're delighted to welcome her back to the Washington History Seminar. Hazel, the floor, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you to the Wilson Center. It's great to be joining you, even though it's virtually. Christian asked me, I think I may have drawn the short straw because it might be less exciting than the other comments. Christian asked me to comment on Benjamin's book in the context of what is increasingly a new wave of scholarship on the topic of North Korea. And so I'm going to try to do that, and I'm going to do it from the perspective of scholarship as an academic for over 30 years. And it's a timely discussion because for those of you that are academics or scholars or work in universities, you'll know that there is a very normal institutional division in our universities between topic-focused departments and faculties and disciplinary-focused departments and faculties. And the reason for that is that universities often do this. They set up topic-related departments, for instance, if there's more funding or if there is public interest, which translates into student fees. I can think of, for instance, in the hard sciences, nuclear often has a topic-related departments because you can get big grants for it. In the European continent, you used to have European studies departments. You could go and get big grants. And these big topic-related departments, and in the humanities, they tend to be area studies departments, are a combination. They bring together a whole host of different academics as opposed to academics working in one particular discipline, whether that's history or literature or international relations, which is my discipline. Now, that it's not an intellectual difference in terms of what we do, it's a sociological and institutional difference. And it's often taken to mean that it's not possible to evaluate collegially, to critically evaluate work within area studies departments because the intellectual grammar is different across the various disciplines that are working within area studies within a particular area, like whether it's Korea or Latin America. And sometimes that the implicit projection is that perhaps topic studies, North Korea studies or European studies, or less so, I think, in hard sciences, need to be researched differently and have different criteria for judging the research than research that's conducted in a particular discipline. That's been an age-old problem in any form of area studies. anywhere in the world. North Korea studies is an emerging single country, but certainly an area studies field of interest, will be facing those issues as it becomes more institutionalized. Fortunately, in many ways, this is really a false dichotomy in my view, but it's worth reminding us it's a false dichotomy, because whatever disciplines we're working in, and if we're all working in different disciplines within a particular area, in North Korean studies, it's frequently literature, history, international relations, linguistics. Whatever the discipline, we share, and again, I don't want to get too esoteric, a common epistemology, a common meta-epistemology. And this is not too esoteric, because all it means is that science or the scholarship, and I use those two words indistinguishably, is entirely based on method. And what I mean by that, again, it's not esoteric. The basic principles of science are that scholarship is about method, and these basic ideas behind what constitutes scientific method are far from esoteric. They include things like defining a research problem by acknowledging and analysing the extant literature, setting out a clear argument and an analytical and intellectual framework that shows how the material will be managed and directed. Replicability, can another researcher following your work, using your footnotes, follow your argument? Transparency of argumentation, substantiating all claims, articulating anomalies in your own argument and acknowledging contrary arguments, not cherry-picking facts to fit the argument, and very tight conceptualization. And that's the case really in one form or the other, whether we're talking about history or physics or international relations. So it's not a problem in terms of, and which is fantastic for scholarship. And it would be, and it's not a problem for us, say, examining master's students or undergraduate students or even PhDs. Well, we're not entirely sure about the empirical material, but we can see whether the method has been adopted, which is appropriate, which does these sorts of basic things which I'm talking about here. But it's an issue which arises particularly in area studies department, because it becomes very problematic for scholars, particularly new scholars, emerging scholars, who must work within the methods and debates of their own discipline if they're to have professional credibility outside the area, but they must also communicate on a day-to-day level, if they're in the same department, with scholars from other disciplines. And to sort this out, who they work with, it's a multidisciplinary, you work with others, to sort this out, it means engaging with these sorts of epistemological issues, which are often, these days, I think, not always incorporated very well in doctoral training. So like most of us, me included, you learn this stuff on the job. You get your PhD, and then as you move ahead, you start to think about, well, what is it that forms the common criteria for how I judge my research? I think it's really, really hard for those working in area studies to cope with this, because in a disciplinary department, there's more chance you'd have that disciplinary framework around you, which hopefully would be reiterating these problems and finding solutions, and they can be very, very challenging. Because it's bad enough to get to grips within the paradigmatic frameworks of one discipline. I mean, in international relations, which I've taught for 30 years, there are hundreds of competing paradigms. Even the most established paradigmatic frameworks, something called political realism, is host to different theories, different methodologies, different conceptual frameworks. So we have to get to grips with them. We have to just learn about them, educate ourselves. And in historiography, which is, I understand that this comes out of a historiographical framework, it's similar. And actually, I was struck when I was reading at Benjamin's book, how relevant the work of the great French Jewish historians Marcel Bloch and Maxime Rodinson, how relevant their work is to this North Korean studies scholarship, this new body of work which we're seeing. For instance, if you read Maxime Rodinson's work on what he called his book on Europe and the Mystique of Islam, you'll find that he's addressing all these historiographical debates. What counts as an expert? What do you do with data? How do you organize the historiographical information? Bloch, of course, wrote on medieval Europe. He can't go and talk to a medieval European. He has to work with sources. And both focused on their specific areas of interest, but they were constantly engaged in the historiographical debates about how to do good scholarship, because in the end, that's how their work is judged. Now, I want to put all that in context, because it's not easy to do good scholarship on North Korea, and it's not easy to do good area study scholarship, which is why I really commend some of the recent scholarship that we're seeing on North Korea, including those that very deftly use empirical sources within disciplined scholarly frameworks. And for those of you, because probably everybody who's involved in this is interested in, by definition North Korea, I really, really commend to you a PhD, which was done a few years ago by Avram Agov, called North Korea in the Socialist World, Integration and Divergence, 1945 to 1970, which I'm pleased to say will be coming out in either one book or a couple of books soon, which is fantastic. It's great, magnificent empirical research, but the contribution to knowledge comes not from the empirical work of itself, but how the material is managed. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And in Benjamin's work, I really commend the effort to get to grip with the empirical data, and also to contribute to this very under-researched topic of North Korean foreign policy. I've published a bit on North Korean foreign policy over the years, but I've always been in despair about my American colleagues who've been coming out with this trope for the last 25 years. God bless you all. I love being in Washington. I love that, if I hear once more North Korea isn't isolated and was isolated in the Cold War, I think, I'll just drop dead, because it's never been true. It's widely known. It's been isolated from the United States, but not from anywhere else. And that's so empirically to have that on the agenda in the United States, which is center of English-speaking scholarship, I think that Benjamin has done a big contribution in getting that into a wider area. So my questions to Benjamin relate to the methodology, to the issue of scholarship, not to the data, not to the content. First of all, the framing of the problem. There is a lot of literature already on the non-aligned movement and the DPRK in the non-aligned movement. There's a Krishnan 1981 study, there's a study by Kirchhoff 2020, there's one by Tribble Bawo 2017, and of course there's Charles Armstrong's work. Now, just because there's been controversy on Charles's work, it doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't be analysed. It's not mentioned in the book. I understand it must have been a difficult thing for you to consider, but I think your work has drawn on Charles's work. I can see it in the book. And so it must, and nothing wrong with that. It's right to do that, especially particularly a 2009 work by Charles Armstrong published by Woodrow Wilson. Really, I think that does need to be front-footed, critically analysed in terms of what you've done with it. And so I want to ask you really a methodological problem about how did you conceive of the research problem when you were starting off? And how did you conceive of the specific body of literature through which you would frame the development of your thesis, your argument, the central point you want to make? What was most useful to you in terms of the scholarly literature? I'm not talking about the data here. So that's the first thing, the first methodological question. I'm not saying here you can know everything or you can read everything. And that's the beauty of scholarship. You're allowed to focus down. You should focus down. Because I think if one doesn't, it can lead into factual mistakes which you really wish you hadn't made. For instance, when you mentioned that China was an NAM power, a non-aligned movement power, which you know it wasn't. I mean, it was never allowed to join the non-aligned movement, which you mentioned on page 92. So I think because your research is so extensive, it helps you if you define yourself a focused body of literature. So I want to know how you thought about that, problem. A second question is methodological, and it relates to the contextualization, the selection, and the critical interpretation of the primary sources you use. Now, there isn't a methodological section, even a small one, as far as I could see. And it's a bit of a risky strategy not to front that up, because you don't want to get yourself in the position where you're using excerpts from primary sources as a foundation for very generalized conclusions. And so I think I would like to see, how did you consider yourself the methodological issues associated with using primary sources, questions of balance, questions of interpretation, questions of triaging information. How did you consider that? So that's the second methodological question. Sorry. The thesis, you mentioned 4 themes which I could pick up on, and I thought they were all really interesting. I was particularly interested, I would like to have seen more developed, perhaps as a central theme even, how North Korea developed its third world policy, for want of a better phrase, as competition with South Korea. So interesting. And where you have the detailed data and you get the chronology together, it really works. You can really counterpose what's happening there and the other. I would love to have seen more of that detailed counterpositioning, where in fact you end up with inductive reasoning. Your analytical development flows from your empirical sources. I think the problem with multiple themes is it's difficult to build up a careful, substantiated argument which has real analytical force. So my third question, which is about the thesis, was that I think your book really well illustrates the international activity of the DPRK during the Cold War. But what is the central argument about that activity? You know, once you've got over to your colleagues that there was all this activity, what's the point you want to, in scholarly terms, what's the central point you want to make about it you're making in this book? I've got some personal interest in this because over these 30 years, which Christian really reminded me how old I am, actually, compared to the new emergent dynamic scholarship, I've taught both in the DPRK and outside the DPRK with a lot of third world interlocutors of the DPRK, from Latin America, even Malta, from Europe. And my view is, and I think your empirical data really substantiates this, and it's actually your empirical data, which is wonderful, contradicts some of the general conclusions I think that you make. Really, these interlocutors, they thought about the North Korean Kim Il-sung particularly, which is what you're talking about, as a supplier of arms, but not really very big or a reliable supplier, often promises not kept. Small amounts of free aid in construction and agriculture. You want to build a palace, go to North Korea. Want some mass games, go to North Korea. Provider of trips abroad for often, people that didn't travel abroad very much from these from these third world movements and didn't have much money. But I think what I would like to see is your argument that translated into respect or influence abroad, because you seem to be arguing both in some ways. I mean, for instance, North Korea had zero influence on Sandinista politics. I knew a number of the players in politics over the years, and they talked to me about their visits to North Korea. They were frankly known as weird. And that was shared by many of their interlocutors, but they kept in touch with them because that was the genre of the time. There was all this internationalism during the Cold War of the Third World, as you point out, quite rightly, and they were a source of something. These poor countries, if you could get something for nothing, fine. Sorry, but that was how it was. I mean, if you didn't have much, why not? The test for me in terms of influence was whether or not North Korea, in the same way that Maoism was influential, was substantially influential on political movements abroad. And apart from a few odds and sods, I don't really think it was. So my final question then is, it's a question of balance, really. Given the all this third world activity that I don't like the word third world, but let's use it because it makes a point. Activity that was taking place during the Cold War period, whether it's the NAM or the Asian Africa Solidarity Organizations or all the rest of it. When you think of the activity of Nehru, of Tito, of Nasser, Nkrumah, Boumediene, Nyerere, Kaunda, Sukarno, I think it's really hard to argue that Kim Il-sung was a player in all that. I mean, a player in terms of having the influence that any of these people had. So my question to you is, what is your view of where Kim Il-sung fitted within these very different traditions of anti-colonialism, but also very universal traditions of anti-colonialism in the 1960s and 70s, compared to, for instance, to the Afro-Asian movement, where a lot of people involved had been trained in the metropoles in Paris and in London, knew each other well before the anti-colonial struggle, had a different view of the world, very different view of the world from Kim Il-sung. Although, of course, they had an instrumental relationships with Kim Il-sung. I think that I'd like to know where you thought, in terms of the relative influence Kim Il-sung had within this movement over the period. And I know you raised that in the book, and I'd like to see more of that, because I think that it doesn't matter to your book, for instance. You don't have to think that your scholarship counts the less because Kim Il-sung was less important at all. Because if you show where the balance is, that strengthens the scholarship of the book, in my view. And finally, the conceptual framework, also a methodology issue. Lots of interesting things you introduced at the beginning, like national identity. And I think that you mentioned somewhere that some of the international relations issues. I think really what would be great to see in this is more distinction between the concept of sovereignty and the concept of power, and the relationship between those two and what that meant for Kim Il-sung, who was really very big on sovereignty, like many, many small nations, because the legal doctrine of sovereignty, many small nations think today even inhibits against foreign interference. But that doesn't translate into issues of power. And I think the whole issue of national identity would have liked to have seen that as an organizing concept and travel through the book and frame your empirical material all the way through. But really, I thought it was a great book, great use of empirical material, great to bring all that into the firmament of American scholarship. So I hope that that these comments are meant to be helpful and broader, and I hope the methodological issues are in this time are meaningful, and that they're helpful to generate part of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Hazel, for these very thoughtful comments and some of the broader issues about the field they raised. Before I give Ben the chance to reply to, there was a lot coming at you, Ben, so I'll give you another split second to think about it. Just to remind our viewers, our listeners, that there are two ways you can participate, preferably by using the raise hand function in Zoom so that we can bring you online to pose your own comments or questions, or you could use the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function in your Zoom functionality to post your question, and I'll then put it to Ben and the other panelists. With that, Ben, floor is yours again.
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of the methodological approaches that I took to this work, North Korean studies, this is my opinion. I really think there's like three dominant schools of thought in how to characterize North Korea. One of the approaches that was kind of first spearheaded by Bruce Cummings is this idea of North Korea as this Neo-Confucian kingdom that is very similar to the Chosun dynasty. The second kind of approach to North Korea is North Korea, the idea of it as this kind of Stalinist model that has a lot more to do in line and similar to Stalinist Russia, and that's spearheaded by Andrei Lonkov. And the third approach that has come on recently is B.R. Meyer's idea of North Korea as more akin to imperial Japan than the communist bloc. But in my book, I kind of go towards the fourth approach, which is not very popular in Western academia, and that is the approach that is spearheaded by Adrian Buzot, an Australian academic, and Wada Haruki, a Japanese scholar. And that's the idea of North Korea as a guerrilla state, that North Korea inherited quite a bit of guerrilla political style and tactics from the days of Kim Il-sung as a Japanese guerrilla fighter, because it was not just Kim Il-sung who was a guerrilla fighter. It was his closest comrades within the North Korean leadership. And they were guerrillas through and through. And they applied this understanding from the 1930s to their worldview. The way that they approached foreign policy was very much in line with this guerrilla mentality. So this is one of the reasons why Kim Il-sung really sympathized with national liberation movements around the world. As I talk about in my book, North Korean military advisors trained foreign revolutionaries. There was quite a few third world radicals traveling to the outskirts of Pyongyang to receive military training. And North Korean military training camps were known for being really good at teaching guerrilla fighters how to be successful subversives back in their home country. And it's interesting, Hazel, that you mentioned that you don't like the term third world. And that term is a bit kind of anachronistic today, but third world was not always a negative term. That is kind of a post-Cold War development. During the Cold War era, third world was actually a term of empowerment. It was used by non-aligned countries and political movements around the world that wanted a different way of development that was unique from US-style liberal capitalism or Soviet-style authoritarian socialism. So the third world was this term of empowerment that was embracing an alternative method of development that was very much aligned across nationalistic, self-reliant lines. And North Korea was part of this kind of movement. And there is quite a few different ways to approach North Korea methodologically, looking at North Korea just internally or looking at North Korea in terms of how others view North Korea. I try to do almost both in this book. And that's because third worldism was not just foreign policy. It was a central component of North Korea's national identity. For example, in North Korea's state-run media, there was quite a bit of coverage dedicated to third world struggles. So on the final 6th page of the Rodong Shinmun, you have articles about building socialism in Mali or a new mass workers' protest in Zanzibar. And so it was part of how the average North Korean oriented themselves in the world, that they weren't alone in this fight against neocolonialism or US imperialism, that they were part of this imagined community of anti-colonial brotherhood. And then I also, of course, look at North Koreans' foreign activities. And I think that's one of the central themes that I want to tell my fellow scholars, academics, and journalists, is that North Korea's domestic policy has an effect on its foreign policy. For instance, we see these North Korean missile tests, and we always think, oh, this is aimed at Donald Trump, or this is aimed at Biden. This is a message to them. There's sometimes stuff going on internally. Yes, it's an authoritarian country, but it still needs to motivate and mobilize the 25 million people there. And they need to give them something to kind of attach themselves to. And third worldism during the Cold War era was one of the things that I think motivated North Koreans to keep on toiling away in the factories and the fields. It is a way for North Koreans to see themselves as part of this broader global movement. And even today, when you look at North Korean state-run media, there's actually quite a bit of news related to foreign developments. Yes, a lot of it is quite negative, talking about how COVID is ruining the world, or they actually talk about the racial injustice issues in the Western world as well. But they are very much talking to a domestic audience and an international audience. There isn't this dichotomy between North Korea's domestic foreign policy and what the internal policy. There's a lot more intersection between the two. And I hope that my book is a good kind of segue into exploring North Korea's domestic foreign policy and how they are sometimes aligned and speaking to each other. And also, a point of my book is talking about Maoism and how North Korea's approach to Maoism wasn't just replicating it, but kind of building on it. I referenced Julia Lavelle's really excellent book on Maoism in the world. And in many ways, North Korea was building on what Maoism generated, this anti-colonial fervor around this world, this revolutionary insubordination. And North Korea took that a step further with Juche. And of course, North Korea did not have the same kind of soft power that Maoism had. For example, there is not African radicals holding up Kim Il-sung's speeches, unlike Mao's Little Red Book. But North Korea took some of what China was doing and building on it. So I hope I answered some of your questions, and I would like it to open up to a broader conversation.
Thanks, Ben. Let's go to Michael Goodman for a first question from the audience.
Christian, after this, could I just come back on one point?
Absolutely. We'll open it up. I'm sorry, I only see one face on the screen every time here. So, but let's why don't we go to Michael Goodman, and then Hazel, I'll come back to you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there's a lot that I could ask, but I'm just going to confine myself to three very small foreign policy questions. And the first is, it's true that North Korea was aiding in the 70s various guerrilla groups in Mexico. But when you look at that, it's really a case of strange bedfellows, because Mexico always pretended to have this progressive, left-oriented foreign policy. That's the image they like to project. So it's interesting that North Korea would become involved in internal politics within Mexico, even though Mexico admittedly was a very repressive country as far as internal dissidence. My second observation would be that I believe North Koreans were involved in training the military in Mobutu's Zaire, which is also kind of mind-boggling, because Zaire was the outpost of the West in that part of Africa. So it's interesting to observe that North Koreans were also there. Then also, I was going to ask if your guests are familiar with the obscure case of a third worlder, Ali Lameda, who was a Venezuelan Marxist who had volunteered to go over to North Korea to translate publications for them into Spanish. And I guess he had made some mild critiques of either the regime or the focus of the propagandistic material he was working on. And as a result of those statements, he ended up in the North Korean gulag for, I think, at least 4 years. I'm wondering if your guests could comment on any of those observations of mine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Ben, but others, Jean, Hazel, should also feel free to chime into on these questions. But Ben, first back to you. Then I'll call
Yes.
Hazel.
So Ali Lameda, I actually reference him in my book. He was one of the first individuals to talk about North Korea's human rights violations, because he was actually in a North Korean prison camp, I believe, for a number of years. And his kind of suffering was highlighted by a number of international humanitarian organizations. I believe he actually published a report, I think, with the Red Cross, and that was one of the first published accounts of the inner workings of the North Korean political prison camps. In terms of Zaire, yeah, it is interesting that North Koreans, I mean, they were all over Africa, building palaces, helping to train militaries, on construction sites. And even today, despite international sanctions, you can still find North Koreans in Africa. For example, there is this African NGO known as The Century, and it's actually co-founded by the American actor George Clooney. They published a report in January 2021 that looked at North Korean nationals working on construction projects in the Congo. They're helping to build monuments there. And it's from this very small art studio known as PECO. And so they're not using Mansudae overseas projects anymore because that's very famous. That's referenced in all of these UN panel of experts reports. They're using these smaller art studios now, and they're actually employing locals most likely to work on these North Korean projects. So North Koreans, they adjust to these sanctions. They adjust to global trends. So yes, North Korea's changed, but it's still very active in the third world, and especially on the African continent. And Mobutu really liked North Korea's regimentation and style of discipline. He was in journalist, and he talked about how he liked how Spartan the North Koreans were, and he wanted to replicate this approach and for his own domestic population. And that's what you get with a lot of these African autocratic leaders is they wanted their own massive personality called akin to Kim Il-sung's. They love the amount of power that he had and the loyalty that he got from the masses. And these African autocratic leaders like Mobutu or Mugabe, they were optimistic, and they saw North Korea as a developmental model that would ensure their own survival and their own wealth. They didn't want to do this for the people of Zaire or the people of Zimbabwe. They were doing this for their own personal benefit. And they saw, okay, these North Koreans, they seem to be very stable. We want some of that kind of governance structure. It just so happens that the North Koreans, their system of brutality and oppression is very hard to replicate.
Thank you. Jean, Hazel, do you want to come in on this question as well?
One point, which is sort of vaguely on the question, it goes back to my methodological questions and also the issue of the conceptual framework. Probably maybe it's for another day, because I think Ben was more interested in the content, and I'm more interested in the method of the scholarship. But one of the things I did mention was the issue of conceptualization. And this issue of third world is really important. As you point out, the idea of the third world was an organizing concept for some, but not all, of the new colonial movements, whether they were independence movements that were eventually taking over states, particularly in Africa and Asia, or supporting movements in the US as well as and in the UK. But it was a controversial concept, because although the intent part of it, all these concepts are inherently contested, was in emphasizing solidarity. It was also seen as sometimes patronizing and implying that all countries were poverty stricken, or victims, which is why I think one of the reasons the term became out of favor. Now, one of the North Korea's issues with the term third world, and one of the things that had a lot of resonance in the famine years, was that North Korea saw itself not the same as even the bigger third world countries, but as much more influential. It saw itself as a potential Japan or Soviet Union or the United States. It wanted to help, quote, and lead this group of people, and saw itself as being able to do that. During the famine years, when I was working there, and one of the things that all the, in the 90s, before the famine response became more institutionalized, and I can see in the participants that there are one or two people, Americans, that were there at the time, Korean speakers, and we all remember was that they were absolutely shocked. Korean officials were absolutely shocked, particularly those that had spent time in Africa, because they saw themselves not as the third world, not as part of that, but as a big country, and you might think this sounds illogical, that was giving aid to the third world in the same way that the superpowers were. It took them a very, very long time to be able to admit that they were receiving assistance. It was one of the reasons that they didn't go for assistance immediately. And it took a very long time, if you look through North Korean government publications in the 1990s, to admit that they were receiving assistance at all. And one of the problems was that they did not see themselves as the third world. They saw themselves as contributing to development of the third world and as part of the leadership and as a potential big power, an industrialized power, because you'll know that North Korea invented itself as an industrialized power in the 1940s. And it was desperate and in a very, very deluded manner, very desperate to promote that image. And of course, as many have pointed out, used all the implicit subsidies from the East European and communist countries to buttress its ability to do that without ever admitting that it had very, very deep structural problems. And it was certainly not an economic or a political superpower anywhere in the world, but it had very real world consequences, particularly for the North Korean population. It was one of the reasons that the North Korean government didn't respond well at all to the famine, and why at least 500,000 people died. So I think we do need to be very careful in the conceptualization. It's not just an academic issue. It is an issue of working out, real life policy problems. And one of them was to do with this North Korea's relationship with the rest of the world.
Thank you. We have a question from Jonathan Chiarella, who's writing because his Zoom is choppy, writing us from Florida. Hello, how much of North Korea's diplomatic and economic successes early on were merely an echo from the past? Japanese occupation focused urbanization and industrialization in the North. Even though the Civil War wiped out so much, North Korea would be able to rebuild if it was already more developed, just as was the case with Japan itself. Until the 1970s, the South was home to most active Japanese collaborators, and North became more legitimate anti-imperial credentials. It seems to me, if North Korea's early successes were a reflection of what Kim Il-sung was doing in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, yes, but more so a reflection of what North Korea's inherited, a country with experience in anti-imperialism and partial industrialization. Ben and others?
It's a very good question. There's no real way to know how much North Korea benefited from Japanese colonization, but they were definitely in a better place than the South Koreans in 1948 because they inherited Japan's industrial bases, which were primarily located in the northern area. But a lot of that also got destroyed during the U.S. air bombardment during the Korean War. As we all know, the U.S. air bombing was brutal, and it was so brutal that U.S. pilots were actually turning around because they couldn't find any more targets to hit. And so, in terms of how much they benefited from the Japanese industrial base, they probably did benefit from some of these resources, but they were also really kind of bolstered by massive amounts of Soviet aid during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then into the 80s. And you also have to remember that there were Japanese troops helping the North Koreans rebuild after the Korean War until 1958. And these Chinese troops weren't just there, helping to, protect the fields and whatnot. They were helping to reconstruct the nation, helping to reconstruct the infrastructure of the North Korean countryside and urban areas. So it was probably a little bit of, three different things that they did get a benefit because that's where the Japanese industrial base was. They had massive amounts from the communist superpowers. And also North Korea was really good at mobilizing the masses, so to speak, in order to rapidly rehabilitate and reconstruct the country after a very brutal 3-year-long war.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time. So Jean and Hazel, feel free to chime in as well. But let me pose a couple of other questions. One by Julien de Cré. Greetings from France. If not addressed, the author should address the role of the DPRK and the Middle East during the Cold War and how it has benefited from this legacy in today's Middle East, especially with Hezbollah. And Linda Wellington writes, well, let me go to Elizabeth Morris. A question about was the U.S. government, particular State Department and CIA, concerned about North Korean activities in the Third World? When did North Korea's foreign engagement rank? Where did North Korea's foreign engagement rank in the eyes of U.S. intelligence compared to that pursued by China or the Soviet Union? Ben?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer these quickly. So I talk actually quite a bit about North Korea's relations with Middle Eastern countries in my book. They had a fairly kind of anti-Israel perspective, and that benefited them in terms of earning diplomatic recognition from Arab states. And so in my book, I talk quite a bit about North Korea's close relations with Egypt and close relations with the Assad regime in Syria. And Maura has a really good question about in terms of how concerned the U.S. government was about North Korea's activities in the Third World. And I actually use a number of declassified CIA files that were actually very concerned about North Korea's approach in the Third World. Yes, obviously the Soviet Union was really the center of the CIA's attentions, but I would say that North Korea was on par with Cuba in terms of how concerned the U.S. government was with this kind of socialist internationalism. I also got some foreign ministry documents from Canada, and the Canadian government even said that North Korea surpassed Cuba in terms of its radical rebellious activities in the Third World. So yes, the US government was concerned with North Korea's activities in the Third World, especially its promotion of anti-colonial insurrection. But I definitely was not on the same footing as the Soviet Union, or perhaps even China. And I guess also to perhaps answer Melinda's question, an old classmate of mine, I'm not sure how my book has actually been received in North Korea. I don't get a whole lot of fan mail from the North Korean government, which is not surprising to anyone, but I'm sure they definitely hate my book. They dislike it. It comes down quite harshly on the North Korean regime, as it should. But I hope that my book also helps Americans realize that the story of North Korea is nuanced. It's not all horrible. It's not all negative. This is a country that has invested in development projects across the Third World for solidarity. It is also a country that has mass human rights violations, has no freedom of the press, no freedom of speech there. So I think it's more important for Americans now than ever to have a more nuanced view of the Kim family regime and the North Korean nation state.
Thanks, Greg. We're just about out of time. Greg Brzezinski, would you like to make a final note before we close? And I turn it over to Eric for final remarks. Greg?
Thank you, everybody, once again, on behalf of the Seeger Center. I put something briefly in the chat before. The Institute for Korean Studies at GW also currently publishes the Journal of Korean Studies. We just published an issue on methods and sources for doing research about North Korea. So if you want to explore some of the questions that Hazel and Ben were discussing in a little bit more depth, there's some really, really excellent essays in there. And I think it's very worth reading if you want to sort of look at what the current state of academic debate is.
Thank you. With that, I'm afraid we're out of time. I apologize to those whose questions or comments we couldn't get to. I do really want to thank Ben, Jean, Hazel, Greg, Eric for just a really terrific conversation. And with that, turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Christian. And I invite you to join us next Monday, November 1st at 4 p.m., when we return to discuss Linda Colley's recent book, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen: Warfare, Constitutions, and the Making of the Modern World. And with that, we say good night and take care. Thank you, everyone.